welcome to a new episode of EPG's podcast on energy topics. My name is Radu Dudău. I'm EPG's president, and I'm delighted to have with us today an old friend and colleague, Andrei Covatariu. Andrei is an energy expert who wears many hats, but has been for quite a few years senior researcher with EPG. And Andrei, I'm delighted to have you. The idea of our conversation today is yours, actually. And I agreed it was useful to debate again the evolution over the past few years of the concept of energy security.
Right.
This was something very much discussed more than 10 years ago in our part of the world. Last time I remember it was about gas pipeline politics coming from Russia, the Russian-Ukrainian gas crisis of 2006, 2009 and beyond. And the discussion was perforce mainly about natural gas, how countries, especially in Eastern Europe, would be able to ensure enough gas supply, and of course affordable gas supply. And then the discussion was in let's say the more theoretical circles,
right,
about access to energy, about affordability, and about system reliability. Not much about external constraints that are so decisive today. Climate constraints in the first place. Back then, there was little discussion about the energy transition and the new technologies. The template of analysis was provided by previous oil crisis.
Exactly.
That we used. So, yeah, what's your thought on the main evolution lines in planning energy security?
Thank you for having me, Radu, first of all. And indeed, it's really a timely conversation to have again after a few years. And I think you're right. We have been talking for years and years about, some layers of the energy security concept or definition. And it started in the 70s, right, with the first oil crisis, and in 79, the second oil crisis. And I think for a few decades, we were referring to, or we were considering the energy security of having two layers. One, either having domestic natural or mineral resources to exploit and to meet the energy demand in that particular geography, and a second layer to somehow have physical and commercial ties with friendly or like-minded countries that have an abundance of these resources that could supply and therefore meet domestic demand. And I think that went on for a number of years and a number of decades. But as you said, I think the energy transition phenomena and the whole debate on getting cleaner electricity systems brought a third layer, the one that I refer to of having the state of either sourcing or having critical raw materials, but at the same time manufacturing or sourcing clean generation or clean technology in general. I think this is a third layer somehow that was brought in the past decade or so, and the urgency of and the importance of this third layer is even more salient now after consecutive crises, the COVID crisis that put some pressure on the supply chains, and then obviously the energy crisis derived from last year's situation, the invasion of Russia to Ukraine. And I think the importance of this layer is obviously affecting the first two layers, the conventional definition of the energy security, and it comes with new, let's say, challenges and opportunities at the same time of this new definition. But apart from that, I think there are so many other factors that are somehow contributing these days to the equation of the energy security definition. We talk about human capital, we talk about cyber threat, we talk about resilience of global supply chains, of course. We talk about access to capital and all these kind of dimensions that are, not as important as these layers, but are contributing to this concept.
Well, they are important, and we will get there because these are the kind of details that we must understand these days. But to your previous point about understanding energy security in terms of commercial ties and market integration. It's true, but I was kind of struck, especially in our part of the world, in Southeast Europe, by a tendency of energy planners and national governments to approach the topic rather in terms of energy independence or energy autarky, which is a reflex, understandable to some extent, but definitely not functional on the long run, and then in itself fraught with risks. Other than that, and then more to the present day, I was thinking, guess 1 week ago, at the peak of the heat wave, how thin the thread that keeps major cities like Bucharest actually is, and what devastating impact energy blackout could have for the air conditioning system.
Absolutely.
And
same for heating
the huge discomfort and dysfunction and public health issues, and then the disturbance that such an incident could bring. And I thought we don't even realize how fragile the situation can become under such circumstances. So it's increasingly about the resilience of the electricity grid and system. It's increasingly about cooling, and not everything about heating in wintertime. So this brings up a new line of challenges, don't you think?
Absolutely. And if you look at the energy trilemma, at the end of the day, security of supply is the most urgent one because it really refers to the present moment, right? I mean, people tend to discount the future. Therefore, they consider climate topics or climate action less important than having today access to electricity, access to heating, access to cooling. So for this reason, arguably, security of supply and energy security are, the most important thing that, decision makers or a system operator needs to consider, at present time. And I agree that, the system in itself and, the whole construction, social and economic construction are so fragile because of this and are so not necessarily fragile, but are, dependent on having a security of supply at a decent level. And I do agree with you that, this part of the world has been seeing a very different, let's say, approach to security of supply, energy dependence, also because the starting point matters a lot when it comes to looking at the energy security, let's say, snapshot, because at the end of the day, it is a snapshot when one looks at a country, context, it is a snapshot, or whether or not it is in the capacity of meeting current needs of energy security, but as well as future needs of energy security relating to energy transition and all that. So starting points matter a lot, and we had very different starting points in terms of energy systems in this part of the world for obvious reasons than in other parts, and that's a conversation that also affects the political, let's say, agenda, which in itself I think it's a sort of a dimension or a factor of the energy security, let's say, concept, because over-promising something that is not reachable within a specific time frame, or promising too much, or promising, let's say, not meeting what the population's needs in terms of what energy security may mean for each of us. It's also a matter of energy security and how that is affected by what people think, and what people vote, and what people endorse at the end of the day, once every 4 years.
Well, exactly. Following up a bit on that, but with a different twist. It's also important to parse out, to understand what the specific challenges of the energy transition are for energy security. In our country, for instance, the major challenge seems to be, how do you exit the coal industry, and how do you replace it? How much natural gas are you going to use in the transition to a clean energy system?
Correct.
On a more general level, you have these celebrated papers that you referred to in preparation for a conversation by Jason Bordoff and Megan O'Sullivan in Foreign Affairs about the transition to a global energy system, getting rid of oil and fossil fuel in general.
Right.
And I guess the correct point they're making is this transition must be controlled and orderly and planned as much as possible, in order to not create disturbance in its own right and energy security challenges. Of course, you have these unforeseen, irrational events such as the Russian invasion on Ukraine. Well, unforeseen
to some extent,
seen from a distance, at least. And then that degenerated quickly in an energy crisis of continental and then global proportions. But again, I felt that we didn't really have the luxury to analyze the issue in terms of geopolitics or international trade alone. You always have to factor in climate change and the climate dimension as an intrinsic element. It's not just a fringe constraint. It's so fundamental and definitional. And there is no way of implementing resilience solutions if they are not climate resilient, if they are not able to cope in all respects.
That's correct.
With the heating weather system.
We've been hearing for the last year or so the idea that now the energy security, let's say, objectives are fully aligned with the climate action objectives. And I tend to, there are nuances, I think, here. I tend to agree that the end point of that is the same, both for the energy security and for climate action, because the geopolitics of energy of tomorrow are less tense, right? The energy will be more locally produced, so there's no need for pipelines and no need for that much of a tense geopolitical, let's say, spectrum. But at the same time, the road from today until that moment, it's full of geopolitical challenges. And I think while the targets are aligned, I think the journeys are very knotty, very complicated and very difficult to somehow manage. And I'll give you the example. I think some of the objectives that we have at the European level, at the European Commission level, are not necessarily aligned. I actually think some of them are actually cannibalizing each other. And I'll give you the example of ramping up renewables in 2030, tomorrow, high ambitions, right, and increasingly high ambitions. At the same time, developing our own critical raw materials, supply chain, mining, refining, and at the same time, manufacturing our clean technology. again, tomorrow, 2030, right? So I think that is, somehow conflicting. There are two conflicting, let's say, objectives, at least for two reasons. One, economics, right? Because you need to choose where you want to put your money first, because if you develop your own manufacturing technology, let's say, sector, then you need to wait to have economies of scale, or you need to pour a lot of cash into that, right, to have results tomorrow. That's the economic side, but then also the geopolitical side, because if I'm China and I'm, supplying PV panels and blades today, and I'm seeing that you will be less dependent on my goods in 7 years time, then I'll probably raise the prices in order to account for the risk of you being less dependent on me. So I think there are, to some extent at least, conflicting these two objectives. So I do agree that the end result, ramping up renewables and cleaning our energy systems, are aligned with the idea of having, higher energy independence, as you mentioned at the beginning. But the road towards that is very difficult, and is not necessarily, hand in hand with the two, let's say.
Well, yeah, I agree, and I see in practice that the lessons learned from the Russian energy crisis, or Russian-Ukrainian energy crisis, are either, as some would like, reverting back to business as usual as soon as possible, which is naive, at least, and irresponsible at worst. To, on the other hand, inferring that the, let's say, climate technology trade with China would potentially unfold exactly the same, which is, again, I think, unwarranted. It's a different geopolitical equation.
It is.
Now, of course, it's justified to be concerned about depending on raw materials from China to such a high extent.
Yeah,
especially
and tomorrow, basically.
Especially that they are also refining most of those critical materials and Chinese technologies. But then this shift towards resilience, I think, shouldn't be understood as a total breakup in commercial ties, at least not in climate-related technologies. With China, I think it's reasonable to reduce the level of dependency from, let's say, 90% to 80 to 70%, to reshore, as the word goes these days, or rather set partnerships with third nations that would develop capabilities in terms of diversifying the industrial base for this technologies, again, from extraction to refining to production of cells and wafers and what have you. So I don't think the game should be, we're building isolated new blocks. The conversation is like that about military issues, but it shouldn't be like that about climate technologies.
Yeah, I agree, and at the end of the day, it's also the two-level political game, right? The game theory. So it is about the conversation and the international diplomacy on how to, have a discussion on China and on, U.S.-China on climate action and energy transition. But at the same time, there are local stakeholders within the European Union, within, the U.S., jurisdiction that, need to understand what's at stake and what it is for them. So that's also, coming back to my point earlier on, about the political agenda, political ambitions, and how the political stability or instability shapes the conversation on both security of supply and climate action and energy transition. So it's a complicated conversation to have. But I agree with you, being passive or staying passive and not addressing this issue in any way, it's also, not a choice for anyone to have, and especially not the European Union that has limited options.
I'm glad we agreed on that. It's not difficult to agree in principle.
Yeah.
But let's look a bit at the nitty-gritty. What do you make of these European strategic documents, the Net Zero Industry Act, the Critical Materials Act, the strive for strategic autonomy in the European Union, and then the US response, which, contrary to the White House's expectation, was not as much celebrated in Europe and across the world, but rather seen as an adversarial set of policies, self-centered, and so on.
Well, I think it is complicated, and I think I'll be honest. I think a lot of the talks that we have and the objectives that we are at least drafting these days, or we have been drafting for a while now, have also the value of ensuring that the European Commission is in control of things. We have managed, and we did manage to, pass one winter, with some difficulties, with cost. The industrial, let's say, activity, decreased significantly this past winter. The weather was mild. We paid the costs, 800 plus billion in euro to shield that. So, but one way or the other, I think the European Union still, needs a pat on its back, because we did manage up to this moment to somehow manage this situation. And I think the value of some of these documents and some of these objectives set for 2030 or plans, let's say, not necessarily targets, have also this value of ensuring, the general public and, stakeholders in general, that things are more or less under control. Let's not forget, next year we will have European elections. We will also have US elections, which, will also shape the politics, the geopolitics in general. So I think there is a value in that, and it's one of the reasons why we have an abundance, an inflation of ideas, strategies, and ambitious targets set. And to some extent, some of them probably will materialize in some sense. I do think that some of them will probably need to be adjusted once we get closer to 2030 somehow, especially on industry. I think the options that we have on critical raw materials, on mining, on refining. When I say options, I mean both resource availability, lead time to exploit those resources, and at the same time, financing option to actually deploy that in time, are rather limited, I would say. So in that sense, maybe there are not too many options, for 2030 for Europe. But once again, if you don't start looking into that, and if you don't start planning, you'll always be behind. Mm-hmm. And similar on hydrogen, for instance, another option for 2030. I do think, and it's a personal opinion, we have a bit too ambitious targets when it comes to that, especially because we still have at European level a electricity deficit. We are trying to electrify more and more the consumption, right? The energy consumption in general. There are so many other options like, demand response batteries, digitalization that will increasingly try to match the intermittent supply curve with the demand curve. So all these are cannibalizing a bit the idea or the priority of producing hydrogen at scale for 2030. So I think that's also something that we will probably, the European Union will probably adjust, downwards in the next few years. But at the moment, I think those were needed, and the options that the European Union had were rather limited. So putting in place or starting to plan some of these options were the only options are actually to have.
Well, I think it's interesting that this year, this first half of the year, the EU managed to wrap up the European Green Deal in terms of legislation, mostly, with only a few exceptions. So we were almost there on a very ambitious legislative package. which kind of sets the EU out in terms of ambitions and really demanding regulation.
Yeah.
We will have an overarching system to tax importing products on the content of carbon. They have.
This could be a game changer for sure.
We'll have to see how the WTO rules are going to be
adjusted
and what will remain of WTO in general, considering also what the US and China are doing at the scale of their state aid programs and subsidies and all that. So it's in a way a high stake game in Europe, and which also, in all fairness, earns some skeptics.
Yeah.
Because the prosperity of the European industry is
at stake. Yeah.
At stake. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And on the point you made, hydrogen seems to be a strategy. It's for me, it's a way of clutching the straws in the EU. We have a lowest common denominator, considering that some member states, influential, refuse some technology options.
Right.
We at EPG tend to be more ecumenical, and we think that at this moment in time we should throw Europe, and then the humanity should throw everything we have in terms of technology and means at the climate change and then abating carbon emissions. So I think it makes sense to still look at new technologies and not think the technological game is over.
Of course.
Everything is a matter of deployment, especially because we are concerned in Romania, but in fact all across Europe, about the rate of deployment for renewable energy sources. It's about permitting in the first place, and I think it's going to be a very tough nut to crack.
Yeah.
And as you said, Andrei, we want to do a lot for 2030. I'm afraid we may lag behind.
Yeah.
So
to your point, I mean, the rate, I think, and the pace of this deployment is also, because we were talking about energy security, it's another factor. It's another dimension of the energy security, let's say, concept, the pace of this deployment. Because we've seen the limits of global supply chains. We've seen the limits of manufacturing across the world, right? So if everyone wants to deploy, renewable technologies, especially in Europe, today, in the next 5-6 years, then, there will be a bottleneck of buyers for these technologies. And for this reason, the limited number of manufacturers will need to differentiate between buyers, to cope with the.
Well, I'm afraid this is
already happening, I think,
with everything, because we have very ambitious targets for everything, for e-mobility, for storage, for renewables, for what have you. So even the garden variety transformation stations are in short supply these days. Everything is in short supply.
Exactly.
So I think the system will have to adjust on many levels, from procurements to
permitting, you were mentioning,
subsidies. Everything is going to be a challenge, but I don't feel like we have a choice.
Exactly.
So we have to cope with it.
Which is both good and bad. Not having a choice and only having this pathway, this road ahead is limits the the ideas and the scenarios to to consider. So there's only this scenario, and once again, as I was saying a little bit earlier, not acting, remaining passive to to this opportunity and challenges. It's not a strategy. So pushing ahead with this policies and with these packages that we've mentioned is probably the only options that we have. But still, some are not have not been crossed from the list, and electricity market design is still one, and it's one of our favorite, let's say, topics. It's still somehow to be adjusted and to be reconsidered, redesigned, in a probably a different fashion to deliver, sooner.
True. Just one thing to mention about this new effort. I think the critical challenge is to safeguard the integrity of the internal market, which is under serious challenges from
not everyone agrees
both
with
sides. Because the reflex right now is for national states, for member states to act on their own. But now that we're heading towards the last segment of our conversation, there is a topic I think should be more developed in the public space. And I think it's this transition towards decentralized energy systems. So myriads of prosumers, small systems, local networks, energy communities. So, of course, I realize that the large centralized systems to produce and transport energy will be in place. But I think this is maybe the most significant shift, which is kind of under the radar and not really getting the attention it
and it's still a low-hanging fruit to some extent, right? We haven't been capitalizing on this opportunity, I think, a lot. I agree, but it is a conversation first and foremost about grids, I think, because this ecosystem of prosumers, of decentralized production and decentralized energy management at the end of the day, because it's both production and consumption locally, and then this ecosystem is unlocked, provided that the grids and the grids of the future and the framework, if you want, the digital backbone of these grids is in place. And I think everyone, stakeholders are taking both grids and digitalization as a package somehow for granted, in the sense that it's either there or it will be organically deployed. We don't need to focus on that because it's across both these topics are cross topics and crossing age, let's say, conversations to have. But for this reason, they are taken for granted, and it's probably something that we shouldn't be doing.
And it's I have to say it's not just about Romania. I realize it's all across the world. It's probably more Eastern Europe than Western Europe, but it's a European problem in general. That's the same problem in the US, the same problem in Australia, in South America. So the grid was sort of neglected.
It was
part of the energy system, and especially in this energy transition where we have to electrify everything so much more.
To some extent, I think in Eastern Europe, because we kind of addressed the grid issues later on, in the last 10, 15 years or so, I think arguably we are in some sort of a better condition, let's say, than some Western, let's say, energy systems that have, deployed grids, 50 years ago or, 60 years ago. And now they're seeing, the well-functioning of these grids have reached the limit, both in terms of quality and, quality of service, also in terms of, volumes available to actually unlock and fully operate this new ecosystem. So I think very different, let's say, dimensions of the same issues, but we are kind of lucky in some sense that we have modernized, over the past few years, quite a bit the grids in some parts at least of the country, versus some other, Western countries that have, neglected that because they had that, for years and years and for decades, and now they need to refurbish and reconsider the well-functioning of those grids. But in general, I agree with you. It's a pan-European, if you want, at least a global, let's say, issue that we will kind of need to address. But yeah.
So wrapping up,
Yeah.
Are you optimistic for, let's say, the next decade in terms of energy security?
Yeah.
What do you think is the main challenge to the energy system in Europe and maybe in Romania for our listeners?
So I think last year has really put the exclamation point, next to the energy security concept. So I think, a lot of us have considered this and the energy trilemma as a package, a bit of a rusty concept that we kind of ditched. We switched from that, idea or framework of, considering things to a much simpler, energy transition process, which was obviously not the case. So I still think on the short run, we will need to make sure that the energy security and the first actually layers, ensuring security of supply in its, simplest form will probably take a lot of our energy and cash across Europe. We still have a few winters ahead. We are quite well today with, 80 plus, 85 plus gas storage insured. So most probably the next winter will not be as difficult as the previous one, but no one, really.
It would be too early to say anything.
Exactly. But we will still need to consider that, for a few winters ahead, and probably the conversation on LNG will take, both time and money for the next few winters, because we need to ensure, as you said, heating, when as well cooling in the summer.
Yeah.
But then on the medium term, there's no other option, as you said.
I should say that we at EPG like to address what we think are the critical lines.
Yeah.
So we are very concerned at this point about decarbonizing the heating system.
Yeah.
About the critical role that buildings will have. About
the industry
rolling out heat pumps.
Yeah.
For industry, we have a whole team devising plans about how to finance the new technologies to decarbonize the process emissions. So in a way, we are at the forefront of this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
We don't feel that policy is following up as quickly as it should. But then again, the rate of the required change is unprecedented, and the sheer volume of decision making is again unprecedented. There are some European citizens for whom everything is too late already, and they urge political action in very drastic terms. Others are unfortunately still indifferent or even not budged about the need to move. But if there is anything by means of compelling evidence, I think this summer again brought us all the hard facts
and the reasons
to understand that we have to act. So on this note, Andrei, I would like to thank you very much for being on our podcast today. It's a team effort supported by our technical team here, Katarina and Oana. I am just an accidental host. Normally, my colleague Mihna Cătuții is doing the honors here. And I trust he'll be content with the job we did today. So our listeners will be able to see the podcast on YouTube, on Spotify, and obviously on our webpage. enpg.ro. Thank you so much.